The courtroom was silent, except for the soft hum of the ceiling fans spinning overhead. Rows of spectators sat at the edge of their seats, their eyes darting between the boy standing at the witness stand and the judge towering behind his bench. The boy, no older than 10, gripped the edges of the wooden podium with trembling hands. His face was pale, his gaze fixed on the microphone before him as if it were a lifeline. The judge, a stern man with silver hair and an expression that could carve stone, leaned forward slightly. "Take your time, son," he said, his voice calm yet laced with authority. "But remember, you're under oath. Every word matters." The air in the room felt heavy, charged with an unspoken tension that no one dared break. Lawyers exchanged glances, their pens frozen mid-scribble on yellow notepads. The defendant, a man in his 40s with a neatly pressed suit, sat stiffly at the defense table. His lawyer whispered something into his ear, but the man didn't react. His eyes were locked on the boy, his expression unreadable. The boy swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He took a deep breath, his small chest rising and falling as he tried to steady himself. Then, with a voice barely above a whisper, he said one word. The reaction was immediate. Gasps erupted from the audience, followed by a cacophony of murmurs and hushed exclamations. The judge's gavel came down with a thunderous crack, silencing the room. His eyes narrowed as he stared at the boy, his demeanor shifting from calm to commanding in an instant. "Order in the court," he barked, his voice reverberating through the chamber. He turned to the bailiff, his tone sharp and urgent. "Lock the doors. No one leaves this room until further notice." The bailiff hesitated for only a second before nodding. He moved swiftly to the courtroom doors, locking them with a decisive click. A ripple of unease spread through the crowd. People glanced nervously at one another, their whispers now tinged with fear. The boy stood frozen, his eyes wide and brimming with tears. He looked to his mother, seated in the front row, her hands clasped tightly over her mouth. She seemed as shocked as everyone else, her face pale as the realization of what her son had said began to sink in. The judge fixed his gaze on the boy again, his expression unreadable. "Young man," he said, his voice measured but firm, "I need you to repeat what you just said. For the record." The boy hesitated, his small hands trembling as they gripped the podium. He looked down, his lips quivering as though the weight of his words was too much to bear. After a moment, he shook his head, tears spilling onto his cheeks. I can't," he stammered. "I'm scared." The judge's tone softened, but his eyes remained sharp. "I understand this is difficult, but you've already said it once. Now, for everyone's sake, you need to say it again." The boy's mother stood suddenly, her voice trembling as she addressed the court. "Please, Your Honor," she pleaded, "he's just a child. He doesn't understand the danger he's in." "Danger?" Someone from the back of the courtroom whispered, and the word spread like wildfire, igniting a fresh wave of unease. The judge raised a hand, silencing the room once more. He leaned forward, his eyes locked on the boy, his voice steady. "I promise you, son, you are safe here, but you must tell us what you know. What you said, it changes everything." The boy looked up at the judge, his small face etched with fear and determination. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. And then, as the boy's lips finally began to form a word, a sudden loud bang echoed from outside the courtroom doors, shattering the fragile silence and sending a jolt of panic through the room. The loud bang sent a ripple of panic through the courtroom. People turned toward the locked doors, their faces painted with confusion and fear. The bailiff reached for his holster, his hand resting on his firearm as he stood protectively in front of the entrance. "Everyone stay calm," the judge commanded, slamming his gavel down again. His voice, firm and unwavering, cut through the rising noise. "No one is to move until I say so." The boy flinched at the sound of the gavel. His mother stood frozen, her hand over her heart as though willing it to stay steady. The murmurs in the room quieted to a tense silence, but the air remained electric with anxiety. The judge motioned for the bailiff to investigate, his sharp gaze darting between the courtroom and the doors. "Check what's going on out there," he ordered, quickly. The bailiff nodded and stepped cautiously toward the door, his movements deliberate. The crowd watched with bated breath, their eyes following his every step. The boy shifted uncomfortably at the podium, his small frame looking even smaller under the weight of so many eyes. Meanwhile, the lawyers whispered frantically among themselves. The defendant's lawyer leaned close to his client, his voice a low hiss. "Do you know what this is about? Did someone outside have something to do with this?" The man shook his head, his face pale but resolute. "No, at least I don't think so." His voice cracked slightly, betraying his nerves. On the other side of the courtroom, the prosecutor sat stone-faced, her pen hovering above her notepad. She wasn't writing anymore. Her focus was entirely on the boy, her mind racing to piece together what was happening. The boy's mother finally found her voice, her tone desperate as she looked at the judge. "Please, Your Honor, can't we just end this? He's too young for this kind of pressure." The judge's expression softened momentarily, but he shook his head. "I understand your concern, ma'am, but we're in the middle of testimony. This court has a duty to uncover the truth." As the bailiff unlocked the door and peeked into the hallway, the courtroom held its collective breath. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then the bailiff stepped back inside, shutting the door firmly behind him. "It's clear," he announced, though his tone lacked certainty. "Must have been a maintenance issue or something outside the building." The judge nodded but didn't look convinced. "Keep the doors locked. No unnecessary movement until we have this under control." The crowd relaxed slightly, but the tension in the room was far from gone. People shifted in their seats, some pulling out their phones despite the clear no electronics rule posted on the walls. A woman in the back row whispered loudly to her companion. "Did you see the look on that boy's face? He knows something. He's scared out of his mind." At the podium, the boy clenched his fists. His shoulders quivered, and he blinked back tears. The judge addressed him gently, his voice losing some of its stern edge. "Son, I need you to take a deep breath. You're safe here, and we need to understand what you know. If you can't say it, that's okay, but do you want to write it down instead?" The boy looked at his mother, silently pleading for guidance. She gave him a shaky nod of encouragement. The judge gestured to the court clerk, who quickly brought over a notepad and pen. The boy stared at the blank page for a moment, his hand hovering over it. Then slowly, he began to write. The room was eerily quiet as the boy's pencil scratched against the paper. Every sound seemed amplified, the squeak of someone shifting in their chair, the faint hum of the air conditioning. When the boy finished, he hesitated, gripping the edge of the notepad tightly. The clerk reached for it, but the boy hesitated, his face twisting with fear. "It's okay," the judge assured him. "You're doing the right thing." Reluctantly, the boy let go. The clerk handed the note to the judge, who read it silently. As his eyes scanned the page, his expression shifted, his brow furrowed, his lips tightening. He placed the note face down on his desk and looked up at the boy. "You're certain about this?" he asked, his tone grave. The boy nodded, his eyes wide and glistening. I saw it happen. I swear." The judge leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in thought. Whatever the boy had written, it had clearly changed the course of the trial. The lawyers stood, ready to object or demand clarification, but the judge silenced them with a single raised hand. "This changes everything," he said, more to himself than to the room. Then he addressed the court. "We'll need a short recess. Bailiff, escort the boy and his mother to a secure location." The mother's eyes widened in alarm. "Secure location? Why? What's happening?" The judge didn't answer directly. "For their safety," he said simply. "Please, ma'am, trust me on this." The boy looked at his mother, confused and scared. "Are we in trouble, Mom?" "No, honey," she whispered, wrapping an arm around his shoulder. "We're okay. Let's just do what they say." The bailiff approached them cautiously, guiding them out of the courtroom through a side door. The boy glanced over his shoulder one last time, his gaze meeting the judge's. It was a fleeting moment, but it was enough to send a chill through the room. The boy knew something that had shaken the entire courtroom to its core. As the door clicked shut behind them, the judge turned his attention back to the lawyers. Counsel approached the bench. Both attorneys rushed forward, their faces etched with confusion and frustration. The judge spoke in hushed tones, his voice too low for the rest of the room to hear. Whatever he said made both lawyers' eyes widen in disbelief. The prosecutor looked over her shoulder at the now empty witness stand, while the defense attorney ran a hand through his hair, visibly rattled. "What does this mean for the trial, Your Honor?" the defense attorney asked, his voice unsteady. "It means," the judge replied, his tone unyielding, "that we may be dealing with something far bigger than any of us anticipated." The murmurs in the courtroom began to rise again, people speculating wildly about what the boy had revealed. But no one, not the spectators, not the lawyers, and not even the defendant, could have guessed just how deep the mystery truly ran. The judge's gavel struck one final time, signaling the recess. But as the crowd filed out, whispers lingered in the air, the unanswered questions weighing heavily on everyone's minds. and behind the locked side door, the boy sat in a small room with his mother, clutching her hand tightly. He didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain. His single word had set something unstoppable into motion. The small room where the boy and his mother sat felt colder than the courtroom, despite the warm yellow light overhead. The mother wrapped her arms around her son, her lips pressed into a tight line as she whispered soothing words into his ear. But it wasn't hard to see the fear in her eyes. Whatever her son had written, it was clear it had turned their lives upside down. The boy stared at the floor, silent and still. He kept replaying the judge's reaction in his head, the way his face had darkened when he read the note. Did he do something wrong? Should he have kept quiet? The guilt and uncertainty weighed heavily on his small shoulders, and he gripped his mother's hand tighter, finding comfort in her presence. On the other side of the courtroom, the judge's chambers buzzed with quiet urgency. The prosecutor, defense attorney, and judge sat around a small table, their voices low but intense. The piece of paper with the boy's handwriting sat in the center, untouched since the judge had placed it there. "This has to be a misunderstanding," the defense attorney said, his voice strained. "He's just a kid. Maybe he misinterpreted something." The prosecutor shook her head, her brows knit tightly together. "Kids don't make this kind of thing up. If what he says is true, we're sitting on a ticking time bomb." The judge, his face lined with worry, held up a hand to stop their back and forth. "Whether it's true or not, we have a responsibility to investigate. But until we know more, I'm not letting anyone leave this building." The defense attorney's jaw clenched. "You're talking about holding dozens of people here. Lawyers, jurors, witnesses. What are you expecting to find?" The judge didn't answer immediately. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the note as though it might offer answers he'd overlooked. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "But whatever's going on, it's not just about this trial anymore." Meanwhile, the tension in the courtroom's waiting area was palpable. Groups of people clustered together, whispering and speculating about what had just happened. Some believed the boy had uncovered evidence that could flip the trial on its head. Others thought it might have something to do with the sudden lockdown, which had only fueled wild theories. One of the jurors, an older man with a sharp gaze, turned to the bailiff standing near the door. "You can't keep us locked up like this without an explanation," he said, his voice loud enough to draw attention. "What are we supposed to think? Are we in danger?" The bailiff, his posture rigid, shook his head. "You'll be briefed soon," he replied curtly. "Until then, please remain calm." Calm, however, was the last thing anyone felt. A young woman in the back of the room clutched her phone tightly, trying to send a message despite the lack of signal. "This isn't normal," she whispered to her friend. "Something's really wrong." Back in the secure room, the boy finally spoke, his voice barely audible. "Mom, are we going to be okay?" His mother crouched down to meet his eyes, brushing a strand of hair from his face. "Of course we are," she said, though her voice trembled slightly. "You were brave, sweetheart. You did the right thing." "But weren't they mad at me?" he asked, his lip quivering. "What if I made everything worse?" She hugged him tightly, fighting back tears. "You told the truth. That's never wrong." The sound of the door unlocking made them both jump. The bailiff stepped inside, his face unreadable. "The judge would like to speak with you," he said, addressing the mother. "Privately." She hesitated, glancing at her son. "Can you come with me?" The bailiff shook his head. "He'll stay here, under guard. It's just a conversation." Reluctantly, she nodded and stood. "I'll be right back," she assured her son, though her heart raced with unease. The boy watched her leave, his chest tightening as the door shut behind her. The mother followed the bailiff down the hallway, her footsteps echoing in the quiet. When they reached the judge's chambers, she found him waiting with the attorneys. His expression was serious, but not unkind. "Thank you for coming," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "I need to ask you some questions about your son." Her pulse quickened. "Has he done something wrong?" "Not at all," the judge assured her. "But what he wrote, it's sensitive information. I need to understand how much he knows and how he came to know it." The mother's hands tightened in her lap. "He's just a boy. He doesn't know anything about courtrooms or legal matters. But he's observant. He picks up on things." The prosecutor leaned forward, her gaze intent. "Did he overhear something? Maybe from you or someone else close to the case?" "No," the mother said firmly. "I've been careful not to talk about the trial around him." The room fell silent for a moment as the judge exchanged glances with the attorneys. Then he placed the note on the table, sliding it toward her. "You don't have to tell us everything," the judge said gently. "But we need to understand why your son believes this. Lives could be at stake." She looked down at the note, her stomach churning as she read her son's scrawled words. She covered her mouth, a gasp escaping her lips. It was worse than she'd imagined. In the boy's shaky handwriting, the note read, "He's hiding something dangerous in his briefcase. I saw it when he opened it before court." Her mind raced, trying to process what she'd just read. She thought back to that morning, how distracted and tense her son had seemed. Had he really seen something? Or was it his imagination running wild? The judge's voice broke through her thoughts. "Ma'am, I need you to be honest with us. Could your son be mistaken?" She shook her head slowly, though her voice wavered. "If he says he saw something, he saw it. He doesn't make things up." The prosecutor stood, her jaw tight. "Then we need to act immediately. If there's a threat in that briefcase, we can't afford to wait." The defense attorney, looking increasingly agitated, raised his hands. "Hold on. My client has the right to a fair trial. You can't just go through his things based on a child's word." The judge's expression darkened. "If there's even a chance that briefcase contains something dangerous, I'm not taking any risks. This is bigger than the trial." As the argument heated up, the mother sat frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to unfold, and her son was at the center of it all. The room felt suffocating. Every breath seemed heavier than the last, and the sound of distant murmurs from outside the chambers did nothing to calm the rising storm inside. The defense attorney paced, his hands moving in exaggerated gestures as he argued, voice growing louder with each passing moment. "This is a violation. We are talking about the potential destruction of a man's career and reputation based on nothing but a child's wild accusations. What next? A search without a warrant?" The prosecutor, her face stern, didn't back down. "We've been through this before. If there's a threat, we can't afford to wait for paperwork to catch up. The boy saw something, and we need to find out what it was. Now." The tension was palpable, and it wasn't just in the courtroom. The boy, sitting alone in the back, stared at the door through which his mother had been taken, his heart racing. He had no idea what they were talking about in there, but he could feel the weight of it. His words had changed everything. And now he wondered, perhaps for the first time, whether it had been a mistake. Outside, the sound of footsteps grew louder as guards filed past, their boots clacking against the tile floor. The building had gone eerily quiet, save for the occasional voice calling for a break or the shuffle of papers. And yet, despite the silence, there was a growing undercurrent of fear in the air. Something was about to happen, something big. No one in the courtroom could shake the feeling that everything hinged on the decision that was about to be made. The judge sat motionless, his fingers steepled together as he stared at the note in front of him. His gaze was unwavering, but inside, his mind raced. Was it possible? Could there really be something in that briefcase, something dangerous enough to warrant all of this chaos? The boy had been adamant, and the fear in the child's eyes when he spoke, the kind of fear no child should ever have to experience, made him think twice. He glanced at the prosecutor, then at the defense attorney, trying to read their faces. Neither seemed to be playing games, but the defense attorney's argument rang in his mind. Was it possible the boy had misinterpreted what he'd seen? Kids had vivid imaginations. They sometimes got mixed up in what they observed. But deep down, the judge knew this was different. This wasn't about a child making up stories. It was about something real, something hidden beneath the surface. And for the first time in his career, he was starting to feel the weight of what it meant to truly serve justice. "Ma'am," the judge said, breaking the silence, his voice low but firm, "I want you to bring the briefcase here. We will inspect it ourselves." The defense attorney's face reddened. "Your Honor, you can't just." "I can and I will," the judge interjected, his tone decisive. He looked at the prosecutor. "Get the bailiff. Now." Minutes later, the briefcase was brought into the room, and the atmosphere in the chambers shifted dramatically. It was a simple thing, nothing more than a worn leather case, one that had seen better days. But in the context of what was unfolding, it felt heavy, too heavy for something so ordinary. The judge eyed it carefully, his fingers trembling as they moved toward the clasps. "Wait!" The voice was sharp and sudden. The mother had reappeared, her face pale, eyes wide with a growing panic. "You don't understand. My son. He didn't mean." "We don't have time for explanations," the prosecutor said, cutting her off. "This is about safety now. We need to know what's inside." The defense attorney, his voice almost a whisper, said, "If you open that case, it's over. Whatever's inside could bring this entire court down. Do you understand that?" The judge, unmoved, gave a curt nod. "We'll cross that bridge when we come to it." He opened the briefcase with a snap, and all eyes in the room were fixed on the unfolding scene. The leather creaked as the lid lifted, revealing a stack of papers. Nothing unusual, nothing that seemed threatening. For a moment, relief swept through the room. But then, at the bottom of the stack, something caught the light. A small, metallic object, shiny, sharp, and unmistakably out of place, lay there, nestled among the papers. It was a device, something that looked far too sophisticated to be sitting in an ordinary briefcase. The judge's heart skipped a beat. "What is that?" the defense attorney asked, his voice trembling. "I'm not sure," the prosecutor replied, stepping forward. "But I know it shouldn't be here." The room grew colder. The metallic objects seemed to gleam under the harsh fluorescent lights, like a ticking time bomb waiting to be discovered. The boy's words echoed in the judge's mind. He's hiding something dangerous in his briefcase. The question now wasn't just whether the device was dangerous, it was what it could mean, who had placed it there, and why. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the sound of the prosecutor moving cautiously to inspect the object. "We need to get this to the authorities. Now." The defense attorney, now visibly shaken, moved to block the briefcase. "I demand you stop this investigation immediately. You have no right to open that case without—" "Enough." The judge's voice was calm but firm. "We're not dealing with speculation anymore. This is real. I'll handle the rest." He turned to the bailiff. "Get this to the proper authorities. Immediately." The tension was unbearable. The room was filled with people who were just as unsure of what to do next as the boy and his mother. The stakes had just been raised far higher than anyone could have predicted. And now all that remained was waiting. Waiting for answers. Waiting for the fallout. In the distance, the boy sat in his chair, his head still spinning. His mother had left him alone again. The guards had given him a wary look as they passed, but no one had explained anything. He didn't understand the device, didn't understand why it was so important. But he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever happened next, it would change everything. His life, his family, the trial, they were all part of something much larger than any of them realized. And as the minutes dragged on, he could feel the weight of the room pressing down on him. What would happen now? Would he be able to fix things? Or had he unknowingly set something irreversible in motion? The only thing he knew for sure was that he couldn't take it back. The moment was gone. And whatever came next, he would have to face it.